Thanks everyone for coming so bright and early on the first face-to-face Learn Tech for a couple of years now. I'm super excited to be back and very excited to be talking to you all today. We're going to talk to you about a course that we created last year and that Lynda has subsequently done some research on. But first I just wanted to tell you a little bit about us. So my name's Sophie. I'm the Director of Learning at Make Real. My background's very much in digital learning design, specialising in training around personal effectiveness, otherwise known as soft skills. And I led the design on the course that we're going to talk to you about today. Lynda.
Hello. Can you all hear me? Okay, great. Yeah, my name is Lynda. I'm a psychology researcher. I specifically focus on empathy and compassion research and training empathy and compassion skills using new and emerging technologies such as virtual reality, augmented reality, and biosensors, biofeedback, and neurofeedback.
Amazing. Right, so in today's session, I'm going to talk you through the structure of the course very briefly. Then I'm going to hand back over to Lynda to talk to you about the experiment that she designed on it and her key findings. Oh, I suddenly sound very booming and loud now. Feels a bit better. Yes, and what her key findings were. And then finally, it will be back to me to just draw out some of the points that we got from Lynda's research and what we'll be feeding in to design better interpersonal skills training in the future. And hopefully you can take some lessons learned from that as well. So we've been working with Lloyds Banking Group for a number of years now, creating a variety of different solutions, everything from sort of virtual reality pieces to more traditional desktop solutions. And after a sort of number of successful courses with them, they came to us with this brief. So they had identified that their colleagues didn't necessarily feel confident about having conversations about mental health. And that was resulting in unnecessary time off, days lost in terms of sick days, and also in terms of mental health conditions escalating unnecessarily. So they wanted to give their employees a chance to practice having more confident conversations. And this felt like a really important brief, but also quite a tall order. So I started to think about where I'd seen solutions in the past that had demonstrated that they could be effective in giving people the chance to practice these skills digitally in order to build their confidence. And I immediately thought of this study by UCL. So University College London, a number of years ago now, conducted an experiment where participants needed to soothe a child in distress. So participants were put into a virtual reality environment and they were confronted by a crying child. They then had to speak aloud. They could say whatever they wanted to try and soothe this child and stop them from crying. In the second half of the experiment, the participants were re-embodied as that crying child. So suddenly they could see themselves, they could hear the words that they'd been using to soothe themselves in the first part of the experiment. And what they found from that, what the researchers found, was that participants actually became more compassionate and less self-critical. No one had told the participants how to be more compassionate, how to better express compassion. It was just through this powerful perspective taking, through this ability of seeing themselves reflected back through someone else's eyes, understanding how their messaging was landed, that their performance improved. So that was really the launch pad for the design that we then put forward to Lloyds. Nice. So the design for this course, the concept is essentially having a video call with a colleague in distress. This here is Isaac. He is your fictional colleague, and he needs your help today. So the course is accessing your device's webcam and your device's microphone, and it's pulling you in to this simulated conversation with your colleague, who is a pre-recorded actor. There's an initial phone call from your colleague Isaac where he comes to you in distress, and you can say anything. That's then recorded and played back to you, and you have the chance to reflect on that and self-assess your performance and think about what you might do better next time. There's then a short sequence of learning screens that help you build your capability before you have a slightly longer conversation following the same structure, where you then reflect back on what you've said. So I think it's quite hard to visualise because I like to think it's a little bit different. So I'm going to play you just a short clip, an edited clip from the training itself. So here we go.
to you if you've got a minute. It's just I've been really struggling lately.
It's okay, Isaac. Thank you for talking to me about it.
So the learning screens, there's traditional click reveals here, coming up slightly more bespoke sort of word games that we created. But the main thrust of this course is this self-reflection piece. So you're going to see our project coordinator here, Ellie. This is her webcam. This is being played back to her now.
Seems strange. Sorry about that. Just thought you were the right person to talk to.
You don't have to apologise, Isaac. Thank you so much for talking to me. Do you want to talk about how you've been feeling lately?
So Ellie now has a chance to reflect. I kind of think of this like a deconstructed multiple choice question. So we've got the hints and tips telling you what good looks like, and we've got the common mistakes that might, be set up like distractors in a traditional multiple choice question. And you read that information as a learner, and then you assess your performance based on this new level of insight. So that is that. And just going back to this here. Right. So this was deployed at the beginning of last year, and the feedback was really exciting. It felt like there was something really different going on here with this course. But we wanted to understand that a little bit better. So we reached out to Lynda so that she could explore the impact that this course was really having. So over to Lynda.
So we ran a classic empirical psychology experiment where we had an experimental group and a control group. Participants were randomly assigned to one of these two groups, and the control group was accessing a best practices version of the application as a more traditional e-learning application. So still very engaging content.
Good to know.
But it did not have the key variable of interest for us here, which was this video-based perspective-taking exercise where the participants receive this self-feedback and they see themselves from Isaac's point of view. So we had a 6-week longitudinal study, so that included 3 follow-ups every 2 weeks. So establishing lasting behavioral change is sort of a benchmark in empirical psychology at all, and is very, very rare with learning technologies and in human-computer interaction research. So we really wanted to show that there were lasting behavioral effects, that people were really integrating what they had learned in the training in their day-to-day lives. So we had the initial baseline measures. So during the baseline measures, we had a pre-test where we had some personality questionnaires trying to get a sense of trait empathy dispersion, making sure that it was balanced between the two groups. And then also taking all of our baseline measures that we compared the post-test and the 3 follow-ups against. So we also had some specific behavioral tasks that we had the participants complete at each of the follow-ups. These tasks included things like reading a fictional piece of legislation and sort of rating how willing you would be to sign and support this fictional piece of legislation, which was based on some statistics at the time, to help funding for mental health. And we also had participants write a letter to their MP, sort of sharing what they learned in the course. And we looked at the language that they used in that letter. And then we also had them invited to an additional town hall meeting to continue learning about mental health. So these are the findings for all of the participants in the entire experiment, so for both groups. And we have consistent affirmative changes pre and post for all of the participants. So we find increases in cognitive empathy. Cognitive empathy has to do with your ability to integrate another person into your own self-concept. It's a construct that's called oneness. It's sort of about recognizing a shared human experience. And then we also found a decrease in negative stigma. So a lot of the research on empathy is kind of focusing on biases, stereotypes, prejudices, and the research on empathy and mental health is very focused on stigmatization. So we found a decrease in negative stigmas. And then we also looked at positive attitude change. So how much do you believe that people with mental health conditions can recover, can succeed in life and live purposeful lives? And we found an increase in positive attitudes as well as that decrease in negative stigma. And then we looked at empathic responses. So empathically responding to another person involves a whole mix of emotions that are both positive and negative. So often empathizing can be very overwhelming. If someone's experiencing very strong emotions, they can have what's called compassion fatigue or burnout, things like distress and uneasiness. So we found a decrease in those two emotional responses, as well as an increase in positive empathy. So this is other focused concern, so sympathy and compassion. And then we also found an increase to engage socially with people with mental health conditions, engage with them at work, to live next to them, to have them as friends, etc. But for all of these outcome measures, they were consistently stronger in the experimental group. And again, that's the group that had that video-based interaction, the perspective taking, than they were in the control group. So this is a chart showing the differences between the two groups. And the percentages that you see here are the percent change from pre-test baseline to post-test. So you see much more significant percent increases in the experimental group than the control group. So this is quite a powerful finding because we see that both groups are increasing these benchmark cognitive empathy and emotional empathy changes, but the changes are much stronger for the experimental group. And I just want to highlight here as well, blame. So there's not such a big change in negative stigma, but we did find that the stigma of blame, which is sort of the extent to which you blame a person with a mental health condition for their condition, to be significantly more decreased in the experimental group. So these are our big findings in terms of the behavioral effects between our two groups. So we found that 67% of the experimental group were willing to sign this fictional piece of legislation. And this is kind of used as an altruistic measure because signing this petition would also cause an increase in personal taxes. So it involves some degree of self-sacrifice for the greater good. So 67% in the experimental group compared to only 30% in the control group. So that's almost double the percent. And then we also found that participants in the experimental group, 70% were willing to give up their personal time. 67% were willing to give up their personal time to continue learning. So volunteering your free time, again, is sort of an altruistic thing to do because you're compromising something of yourself in order for continuing to support this cause. And then in the letter writing task, we found some really interesting analyses in the linguistic analysis of the language that the participants are using. So we found that the control group is using the word awareness in their writing, and they're writing in a more matter-of-fact tone about what they learned, versus the experimental group is writing in this very emotional way, this very passionate way, with a sort of moral tone and a social justice advocacy tone. They're also using much more we words than I words, showing like a community intention, a sort of inclusivity, a sense of being in it together. So this is a chart marking the increase in cognitive empathy from pre-test to post-test for both groups. So this series of increasingly overlapping Venn diagrams is the classic inclusion of the other in the self scale that is used to measure cognitive empathy. So it measures how close you feel to a person with a mental health condition. And participants rate the circle that best represents their relationship at the time. So we found significant increases from pre-test to post-test in both groups, but the degree of change was higher in the experimental group than the control group. And interestingly, I was kind of interested in trait perspective-taking ability because people vary in how good they are at imagining themselves in the shoes of another person. So I found that people who were lower in trait perspective-taking ability had more significant increases through the course for both groups. However, that increase was more significant for the experimental group. Again, this makes sense because the intervention we used involved a perspective-taking exercise, but it still validates that that exercise is particularly useful and helpful for people who are poorer in perspective-taking as a natural dispositional ability. This is also the willingness to sign that petition. So on the right-hand side, you can see the script that we used for that petition. So this involves increasing sick leave for mental health as well as for physical health, and increasing the accessibility and availability of mental health resources in the workplace. And we found that the experimental group was, again, a little more than twice as likely to be willing to sign this petition than the control group. And this is the town hall responses. So we had 4 different responses for the town hall. It was an email invite that was sent out, and it was sent out separately from the experiment. So it really seemed like it was just something that was sent out by the workplace. So we did that to sort of hide that it was included as a measure. And we find that, again, this huge difference between how many of the participants are accepting this invite is quite stark. Of course, there are people who didn't respond at all, which could be that they didn't see it. But still, that difference is so significant, I think is quite interesting. And then also the difference in those who declined. We find many more in the control group declining that invitation. And this is the linguistic analysis. This is quite an intense table, but the main point here, so on the right-hand side, we have a word cloud that shows the main words that were used by the experimental group. And you can see very clearly that it has this sort of community, people, services. They're very focused on the pro-social advocacy. Their language is much more indicative of desire for social justice. It has a stronger emotional tone, more positive emotions, more of a moral tone. They refer to wellness much more. So there's a difference in the style of the writing, being much more passionate in the experimental group. So just to summarize, these are some of our key findings. So we find that participants are more willing to give up their personal time and to have a personal sacrifice of paying higher taxes in order to support learning more and to support the cause of improving mental health. We also found that they were using more proactive and inclusive language in the experimental group than the control group. And finally, this very interesting finding, I think, is that the course is specifically useful for those who struggle with perspective taking. So I'm going to hand it back over to Sophie.
Nice, thank you. So, I'm going to trip over some things, and then I'm going to just very briefly pull together what it is that we're taking from Lynda's research to make sure that we design better interpersonal skills, soft skills training in the future. So, another list of 3. I like lists of 3. So what really struck us from Lynda's research was that both groups, so both the group that had that webcam simulation and the group that didn't, became more empathetic as a result of this training. So it shows that well-designed training can be effective. But it was really the experimental group, so the more immersive group, where they became activists, right? So they were more willing to give up their time, their personal time, to promote causes to do with mental health. And in the linguistics analysis portion of the experiment, they were using more active and inclusive language. And for us, these are the 3 key things, the differentiators between the controlled experiment and the experimental version that's really driving that change. And I'm just going to talk you through each one now. So firstly, the most important thing is this powerful perspective taking, and that's backed up by other research as well. It's really only by seeing ourselves through another person's eyes that we can hope to improve. So in our solution, that was reasonably technically complicated. It doesn't need to be. I think in its most basic format, it is just encouraging people to think about how they're coming across to someone else. And in doing that, we can see from Lynda's research that your ability to change really increases there. For me, it's the next best thing that we can have to having a personal coach is giving people the opportunity to have a period of guided self-reflection. In training, we often get quite fixated on showing people what good looks like. But if we're not showing people what good looks like in relation to their current performance, then we're really capping their ability to make a positive change. So the next point here is about the emotional context that we offer people so that they don't just become trained bystanders. So the phenomena of trained bystander syndrome is where people know what to do, but they don't act in the moment because they're much more familiar with the theory than they are with the feeling. And interestingly, what we found was that our experimental group, so the group that had the more immersive experience, self-reported becoming less confident, even though they demonstrated more likelihood and more ability to act and to change their behaviour. So I suppose that suggests that what's going on here is this emotional context on the surface level is maybe shaking people's confidence a little bit, but it is leaving them better positioned to make a positive impact and to rise to the challenge. Finally, and linked to the previous point, is about offering people an emotional space. So when we create soft skills training, interpersonal skills training, we very often promote a logical response. So we'll present some options on screen, we'll give people time to read them, to think about them, and then to make a decision. But that's sort of accessing a very different part of our brain that we're using when we have a difficult conversation. So that's sort of stimulating our logic centre as opposed to our emotional centre. I think what Lynda's research shows us is that that's still valid. That's still an impactful thing to do. But if we can get those two things working together, if we can give people the opportunity to apply best practice in the right emotional context, then that's really where we see some quite exciting results. So that's what we're taking away from Lynda's research. I think we're doing okay for time. So yeah, I think we've got 5 minutes for any questions, if anyone wants to throw anything at us now. Also, very quickly, we are on stand L10, which is nice and easy to find because it's the other side of this wall. So you can come and you can give the experience a go, and you can ask us more detailed questions then as well. But
we also have is my mic still on? Yes, okay. We also have some more detailed printouts about the study if you want to learn more. And
yes, that's true. Yeah, absolutely. Come and collect them.
3 questions.
So there's 3 questions.
Sample size, statistical validity, and then the third question is about way to use pre-validated psychometric questionnaire to test empathy or emotional intelligence.
Okay, let's do one at a time. So, first question is sample size. So, well, Lynda, you got the final. We were going for about a group of 100, but you had...
Yeah, so we had 200 participants in the total study, but the follow-ups, we lost participants. So we had 155 in the total by follow-ups. Yeah.
So it's in some groups, yeah. Is that answer that one? That's point 1. The second one wasn't a question. Can you frame that as a question?
So, were the results statistically valid?
Yes. I didn't want to overwhelm you with statistics on these slides, so yes, if you pick up the pamphlet, it has all of the statistical significance, the p-values, yeah.
And we also have a full academic paper. If anyone really wants to dig into the detail, there is, you've created a full academic paper sort of detailing the studies that will go through this in amazing detail. But for anyone who is maybe just happy with the headlines, we've also got something that's a bit more user-friendly. So both options are available.
All the findings that I presented were statistically significant.
And why not use a pre-validated psychometric questionnaire like emotional intelligence or something related?
Yeah, I mean, so these are validated questionnaires within empathy research.
Can I just tell everyone what the question was? So why not use, sorry, say it again, why not use pre-validated psychometrics questionnaire? And Lynda is going to...
Yeah, so most of the questionnaires that we adapted come from the empathy literature, so emotional intelligence would have been wonderful to include as well. We had to sort of be selective about which questionnaires we were using because we had so many. So the design that I used was sort of adapted from a Stanford experiment. So is sort of state of the art for showing behavioral increases for empathy. So we did use the interpersonal reactivity index, which is definitely indexing something very similar to emotional intelligence, but it's more focused on social emotions. Yeah. It's a great question.
Yeah, cool, thanks. Any other questions? No, I think we baffled you with science, blinded you with science at the last moment. Hopefully not. But yeah, thank you so much for coming today. Oh, you have a question.
It seems to be very focused on the mental health part of it. And I'm wondering about more technical production side sort of soft skills. Is it applicable?
Is it applicable?
To that, and if so, how would you sort of reconduct these to a more perhaps less deep, more technical production side soft skills?
Yeah. So that question was about, and yeah, that was something we were very aware of when we were designing the study, is to not make it too mental health focused and to make it more about the principle of self-reflection for interpersonal skills and whether it can apply to other areas of interpersonal skills. I think that's a very valid question. I think that's why we concentrated more on empathy generally, as opposed to, obviously there were measures specifically to speak to the mental health point, but it was about empathy more generally. I think when we're empathizing, then we are better at relating, and that's, other studies have shown that improves the way that we interrelate with people sort of across the board in terms of like coaching, for example. We become better coaches if we can become more empathetic, and that's why we were kind of centering the study around that area of things, because I think that becomes more sort of broadly applicable. Lynda, I don't know if you have anything to say on that?
Yeah, so you were asking also if this kind of course would be applicable for people working within more technical industries who maybe don't have as much soft skills training in general, or aren't having as many discussions, with their colleagues. And I think yes. I think from some of the research I've done, I've actually shown some of the biggest increases to be with people who were sort of lacking in these skills or not engaging with them as regularly. So I would definitely say yes. And I'm sure there could also be a version of the course that could be adapted for that population specifically to meet their needs. Yeah, I think definitely in terms of what your research showed in terms of people who are not as good as perspective taking to start with, they had the biggest gains. But equally, I guess our principle is this concept of empathy is really underpinning how we relate in lots of different, in all the different gambits. So anything to do with sort of coaching, difficult conversations, giving and receiving feedback. If you're not coming to that with empathy, then you're kind of setting yourself up to fail. So I think it's fair to say that this research has implications for all those areas. Any more for any more? And if you don't have a question right now and you think of it later after having some time to process and reflect, I will be here at the stand as well as Sophie, so we'll be happy to answer questions there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, do come and grab a brochure from the research we've done. Thank you so much all for coming today. It was great.